It is 23 after 2 p.m. Central African time. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. This is SA Today on SABC News. We're coming to you from Johannesburg, and I'm Samkele Maseko. We've just seen, a cluster of ministers wrapping up a media briefing with regards to the gradual reopening of the country's economy and the lifting of some of the restrictions on some sectors and industry. And that briefing was held by the minister in the presidency, Jackson Mthembu, together with his colleagues, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, who is the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs Minister, and the Trade and Industry Minister, Ebrahim Patel. But then for more on the level 4 restrictions, we now cross to our reporter, Samkele Maseko, who is in Pretoria, who was following closely that briefing. Samkele, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. What are the key takeaways that came out of this briefing?
A very good afternoon to you, Simpiwe. In fact, we are in Johannesburg. We're following that particular press briefing virtually just like other journalists within this practice of ours these days, that we are not allowed to be in that much close proximity or contact with any of these political leaders due to this COVID-19 pandemic. But one of the key factors that came out of this particular briefing is that the lockdown still remains intact. Much of the restrictions that are there in place within stage 5 now, which is characterized as stage 5 load shedding, which we are currently in, is still there. People are still have to stay in their homes. Only those within stage 4 that will be going to the various businesses that will be opening will be permitted to leave their homes, but they will only leave their homes if they are wearing these masks or any other mask that protects them and prevents any spreading of the droplets of the COVID-19 in forms of transportation. Listening to that press briefing, they're listening to the COGTA Minister, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, saying that she just received an SMS from one of her compatriots in Swaziland who was saying that there was an incident in the public transportation system there, where in the taxis they were asking passengers to bring back their masks and give those masks to other people. That is prohibited and is restricted from happening, as that also spreads COVID-19 within South Africans. But what was also rather interesting in this press briefing is that the restrictions that no parties are allowed, people have to stay within their homes, you can't leave your home. The only time you can leave your home is when you are going to a workplace of employment. Even within those businesses that will be opening, they will be required mandatory by the state and the regulations to conduct mandatory testing and screening of their employees, no matter the workforce that will be there. The restaurants that will be opening, they will only opening to deliver items of food that will be ordered by the various South Africans, which will influence the transportation system within the goods of these restaurants that will be opening. No sit-ins will be allowed.
Now, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, said that South Africans should stop beating the system. Well, she stopped short of saying, do not act smart with regards to the lockdown regulations, and, mentioned something to the effect that some people buy coffins under the guise that they are conducting a funeral and, just to move to other provinces, saying that, they're taking the virus to the other provinces and then taking the virus back from those provinces to their home provinces. So from your understanding, from what you've seen or heard on the ground, Samkele, do you think people still embrace the lockdown restrictions?
Well, you've seen one of the reports by our very own colleague Natasha Piri during the week, when the MEC of Community Safety in Gauteng, that would be Faith Mazibuko, when this particular young lad was trying to move his girlfriend from Johannesburg to Mpumalanga, and those showed that some South Africans are not observing the restrictions that were there in stage 5. He was basically trying to smuggle his girlfriend from Gauteng into Mpumalanga. He was caught and they were both arrested. There was one incident where you saw the mayor of Johannesburg, Jeff Makubu, in one of the roadblocks. One particular individual was saying he was going to have a meeting with Mayor Jeff Makubu. Turns out that the man he was saying he was going to meet was the one who was conducting the roadblock. He was obviously lying and saying he was going to meet the mayor of Johannesburg. So there are those South Africans who are not observing the rules and the regulations and the restrictions that have been put in place within this particular lockdown of stage 5. But also there are those who are observing the various regulations, staying in their homes and not going out. We saw some other reports of some South Africans living in rather lavish suburbs, doing about their own business, jogging, which is not permitted within stage 4 or stage 5 of load shedding. Some South Africans are not observing that. So there are those South Africans who are trying to cheat or trying to beat the system. For instance, in the Eastern Cape, as Minister Jackson Mthembu has just alluded, there was this particular incident where they had went to a funeral and those people came into contact with someone who was a carrier of this particular COVID-19 virus. 40 of those individuals who were at that particular funeral have now been infected with this particular pandemic. There was a report in one of the regional newspapers within the Eastern Cape. That would be the Daily Dispatch. So there were some of the issues that South Africans are grappling with. And then of course, obviously, there are those South Africans who are using the issue of funerals to try and commute and travel into other provinces, which is prohibited within stage 4 and stage 5 load shed, which is the lockdown which we are currently in. I almost said load shedding there. There's no load shedding, but the lockdown. So there are those South Africans who are trying to cheat the system. Minister of COGTA, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, saying that is not allowed. Mind you, I always report on Eskom as well. So load shedding is always at the top of my mind.
I always mention load shedding. You're not alone there, Samkele. Now, the contentious issue of cigarettes, or the lifting of the ban with regards to the sale of cigarettes, Samkele, has been very, contentious, with so much criticism being leveled to the government as to what kind of scientific evidence did the government conduct to come to the conclusion of lifting the ban on the sale of cigarettes, because it still remains coronavirus, I beg your pardon, still remains a respiratory disease, and smoking is a catalyst of inflaming that kind of that kind of disease. And Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma also mentioned this thing of what's it called, puff and pass, where people share the smoking of cigarettes. Do you think the government has dropped the ball on this one?
The best person to ever illustrate the issue of cigarettes or the tobacco industry in South Africa is, in fact, that very same woman, the former Minister of Home Affairs here in South Africa, and Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, now COGTA minister. You'd remember just in 2017 alone, she was involved in a court battle with British American Tobacco with the various restrictions she was fighting with the tobacco industry and raising the issues of puff and pass. You've had many industries and restaurants then. South Africans then at the time used to smoke anywhere and everywhere. And then you had restrictions being put in place and regulations that there must be designated areas in restaurants, in bars, where people will be able to smoke. Even in the workplaces, there must be designated areas where people can smoke. So Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma has been fighting this particular battle for the longest of time with the tobacco industry. Her views are known when it comes to the issue of cigarettes. In fact, one of the callers who called in this virtual press briefing did raise the issue of government dropping the ball when it comes to the tobacco industry and allowing cigarettes to be sold. You'd remember many people have been raising the issue of cigarettes. Even the World Health Organization itself, to Dr. Tedros and through its own Twitter account page, have raised the issue that governments across the world should not be allowing or permitting cigarettes to be sold in this era of the COVID-19, because those whom infuse or inflame these particular fumes of tobacco will then have negative impact on their health should they contract this particular pandemic of COVID-19. It has an adverse effect on their health and it should not be permitted. And the World Health Organization is saying that the tobacco industry is playing a hardball when it comes to being patriotic, when it comes to the fighting of this particular pandemic. For instance, I received a number of emails from various cigarettes companies lobbying on this particular issue. Even there was an email, I saw an article on one of the international media organizations, Al Jazeera, on this particular matter of British American Tobacco, lobbying for cigarettes to be sold about 3 weeks ago. So intensive lobbying has been happening with regards to this particular issue of cigarettes. In fact, if you go to the address that the president was speaking to the nation on Thursday, he went into detail and speaking about some businesses opening, but the one business that he mentioned categorically clear that will be operating and will be selling is the cigarette business. And one may argue that maybe the president, that's the essential message that he gave to South Africans, that this particular lockdown will be reduced to stage 4 And the only economic issue that came out and was very clear of that address by the president is that cigarettes will be now permitted to be sold to South Africans. And the World Health Organization is seemingly against this move that has been endorsed by the South African government.
Samkele Maseko, our reporter, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate your reflections and your thoughts on this matter.